Thank you, Senator Wong. Senator Siewert.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. It gives me great pleasure to be able to rise to again talk about the progress, and there has been a little bit progress we are making in closing the gap. Would first like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and future, and recognise this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. As my colleague and the Australian Greens leader, Christine Milnes, said this morning at the Close the Gap breakfast, the Australian Greens have been strong supporters of the Close the Gap campaign. In fact, the Close the Gap initiative, even before that was adopted by government, we were there campaigning for this process. And it is important to remember that tomorrow is the 6th anniversary of the apology, something that people had been working on for decades and decades. And we need to be careful to remember that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And I expressed my deep concern that with the number of Aboriginal children that have been taken into care in certain states around this country, I think that we are facing potentially the same situation again. And I would like to think it's very important that on this day we remember that and make sure that we put policy provisions and programs in place to ensure that the number of children being taken into care is urgently reduced, and that we put in place programs that support and nurture parents. We welcome the fact that we have seen the government's statement today in terms of outlining the progress, and we welcome the opportunity that each year we focus on what progress we are making. And on that point, I welcome also the report that used to be called the Shadow Report, but isn't called that anymore. It's the report of the Close the Gap Steering Committee, and I recognise its importance of informing the committee of what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations and communities think about the progress against the targets to close the gap. And as I do every year, I table or seek leave to table their report, Progress and Priorities Report of 2014 from the Close the Gap Campaign Steering Committee. I have given whips from both the Coalition and the ALP copies of the report.
Senator Siewert, you need to seek leave.
I did seek leave. I said I seek leave to table the report.
Is leave granted? Leave's granted.
Thank you. Thank you. This is an important day to draw attention to the progress that has been made, and particularly in highlighting the areas where we still be needed to make progress. I should note here that while there is unity in purpose and commitment to close the gap amongst politicians and the political parties in this place, that does not mean and should not mean that there is unity in agreement with the approach. In fact, it would be a failure of this process if we weren't being rigorous in our analysis of the approaches that are being taken to the policies that seek to close the gap. I, for one, as have other members of the Australian Greens, been critical of some of the approaches. I continue to be critical of the approaches that are top-down, paternalistic and punitive. Our approach, our concerns about income management, as an example of that, are well known. And I will flag a concern here that while we share absolutely and acknowledge the need to increase school attendance, unless we are ensuring that education meets the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and is delivered in a way that meets their needs, it will fail. There is no use just sending around truancy officers to get kids into school if those kids aren't having the curriculum and bilingual approach. It's not going to ensure that more children are completing their education. If children can't hear and I have outlined those concerns in this place many, many times. Unless we address that fundamental issue, we will not address the literacy and numeracy concerns and skills of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. And yet I see very little move to fund that particular area. It is essential that we have long-term investments and long-term commitments. We need to remember that we are in this for the long haul. The fact is, as has been articulated by both Senator Milne this morning and the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, and in fact speakers here in this chamber just now, have highlighted that there is still a much higher burden of disease, 2.5 times that of the non-Aboriginal population. And this, for a start, clearly shows that we still have a long way to go. While there has been some progress with a decrease in the mortality rates in Queensland and Northern Territory, there has been no significant changes in the other states. Clearly, we need to keep going. But at this stage, unfortunately, the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Plan and, in fact, the National Partnership Agreement on Closing the Gap in Indigenous Health Outcomes, they've expired. And we still haven't, despite our supposed commitment to these targets, we still, in Australia, have been unable to reach agreement at COAG for the next agreement, and the states and territories still haven't completed their commitments to the next health plan, the 2013 to 2023. If we are serious about this, we should have signed on as those programs expired. But unfortunately, we're still hanging out for that agreement. And I suspect we're still going to be hanging out for the agreement on early childhood development for Aboriginal children as well, which has just expired as well. How long are we going to have these gaps in these programs and in reaching this agreement? I'm very pessimistic about how soon we are going to actually have sign-off and properly implement these programs. We are pleased to see that there has been some move, but we are picking up on the call from the Steering Committee, who are being very clear in their report that they need from the Abbott government to see a clear time frame of 12 months for the national implementation of a strategy for the delivery of the health plan to be set out. Prime Minister Abbott has promised to focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders issues in his first term as Prime Minister. Well, he obviously needs to make sure that the states and the territories are also on board and that everybody is committed to delivering those outcomes. We can't be serious about addressing closing the gap unless we have signed off on that particular issue. It's clear from the Steering Committee report that getting sign-off and implementing the health plan is an absolute priority, so we endorse those moves. We also are concerned, as is the Steering Committee, about moves to potential cuts to funding like the PBS that have been canvassed by the Commission of Audit. These are very important. PBS and those sorts of services are very important to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. When we talk about targets, the Prime Minister mentioned some new targets in his statement to the Parliament this morning. The target that he missed out is the justice target. If we are to close the gap in this country, it is the shame of Australia that we have such a high rate of incarceration for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders across the board, but in particular young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. When are we going to see a commitment across Australia to a justice target and to ending this atrocious record of incarceration in this country? One of the programs that we should be investing in is justice reinvestment. We have had an inquiry, and Senator Penny Wright led that inquiry. The evidence is clear. We need to be investing in it. And what will drive that investment is having a target as in the closing as part of the Close the Gap targets. It is absolutely critical. I repeat, unless we address this issue, we will not close the gap. The Greens will continue to support the Close the Gap
Senator Stewart,
campaign.
your time has expired.